This is lecture 130 in the ABCs of Communism series, and the second lecture in support of the forthcoming Volume 8 on Communism in North America prior to white contact. So we're going to begin this lecture 130 with the North American Lithic stage, because I follow the periodization terminology of Gordon R. Willey and Philip Phillips, as published in their classical textbook Method and Theory in American Archaeology. Therefore, we begin with the first of the New World stages that they termed the Lithic. And in general, the Lithic is in the New World the equivalent to the Old World Paleolithic. Now, North America in this book refers to Canada, the USA, and northern Mexico. And we begin our review of the peoples of North America with the earliest sites of primitive communism in North America. And that is in northwest North America, where we have now by 24,000 BP humans occupying the northern Yukon at Bluefish Caves. From there they made their way eastward to the Atlantic coast and southwards through Alberta's ice-free corridor to southern British Columbia and Washington State that they occupied in late Pleistocene times. As the last glaciation of the Rockies melted, so did that part that formed the ice dam containing Glacial Lake Missoula. This is a huge dam, a huge lake, and every time that ice melted, you have water about 2,000 feet high rushing all at once across the plateau of Northwest America, and it doesn't really stop until it hits the Pacific Ocean. Now, for our purposes, the important thing here is that naturally this wipes away most of the people and the evidence that they had left behind from earlier occupations. So we've got a big blank spot there from southern British Columbia all the way to the state of Oregon, and actually it would have flooded the Snake River too, so it would have flooded large parts of Idaho. At any rate, there is a big blank in there. So the point, I guess, to all of this is that Glacial Lake Missoula released these cataclysmic floods periodically across eastern Washington and down the Columbia River Gorge at the end of the last ice age, that is between 15,000 and 13,000 years ago. Now, these glacial lake outburst floods were the result of periodic sudden ruptures, as I say, of the 2,000-foot-high ice dam on the Clark Ford River that created Glacial Lake Missoula. After each ice dam rupture, the waters of the lake would rush down the Clark Fork and the Columbia River, flooding much of eastern Washington and the Willamette Valley in western Oregon. After the rupture, the ice would reform, creating Glacial Lake Missoula again. Now, these are such distinctive features, called scabland features in geology, for a long time before their origin was understood, came to be understood when our exploring spacecraft reached Mars, and there they saw the same kind of scabland structure. And so this made geologists think back in the U.S., well, maybe this sudden release of water explains why we have this thing. And they started in the scablands of eastern Washington, and so they started looking for it. And of course, they found this the fact that this dam had existed for 2,000 feet, and when it breaks, it washes away. It comes all at once. So you can kind of imagine that if you were standing anywhere within 100 miles of the collapse of this ice dam, you would suddenly be confronted with a huge wave of water from which there was no escape. At any rate, at the end of the last glacial maximum, the cycle of flooding and reformation of the lake lasted an average of 55 years. There were 25 massive floods between 15,000 and 13,000 years ago. The largest discharge was equivalent to 13 times the total of the Amazon River, and the peak flow at the largest flood may have been 60 cubic kilometers per hour. The maximum flow speed was about 80 miles per hour, and its 2,000-foot wave struck all at once as the dam burst all at once, taking hundreds of miles before losing significant amounts of water and emptying into the Pacific Ocean. From an archaeological perspective, this has meant that there is a dearth of information about a critical time period during the Wisconsin Ice Age when humans occupied northwest U.S. plateau. To pick up the trail, we have to move southward. So we'll next go to Oregon. Now, the great washout of the state of Washington occurred in the critical time after the initial human migration into the Western Hemisphere. People had also moved across the Arctic coast to the Atlantic and down the Atlantic coast. Now, their movement through the far west we pick up again in the state of Oregon. Peoples occupying the far west of North America evolved from the Lithic stage hunting and gathering to a true broad-spectrum wild resource exploiting mode of production by the end of the last ice age. Much of the last 100,000 years featured big game hunting and broad-spectrum wild resource exploitation, and during the last 11,000 years, this economy expanded to include grinding tools for processing wild plant seeds. Baskets were used in harvesting seeds and nuts. Watertight basketry could be used as containers and even as cooking utensils. Now, in my initial foray into academic and archaeological research, I searched the site reports done for the earliest levels at Fort Rock Cave, that's in southern Oregon. I was in the greater Los Angeles area when I did this, and there the Southwest Museum Library in Pasadena had the original site reports of Luther Chessman on that cave and others. Now, he was looking for evidence that people had invented, or I was looking for evidence that people had invented the technology to grind wild seeds. And indeed, I found grinding stones reported in the earliest levels of 13,200 BP of that cave and several northern Great Basin sites. Now included for this horizon are Cougar Mountain Cave, 11 miles from Fort Rock Cave at 11,000 BP, Paisley Caves at 14,250 BP near Paisley in south central Oregon, and Indian Sands on the Oregon coast near Brookings at 12,000 BP. Now in Idaho, excavations of Ruth Groon in Jerome County, northeast of Twin Falls, recovered human occupation in an elevated lava bubble at Wilson Butte Cave dating to 15,000 BP. Now this is a bubble that sits clearly way above ground in an otherwise flat area. So you can imagine that as the Snake River was being flooded by these outbursts from Glacial Lake Missoula and the dam burst, the Snake River would rise, people could run to this cave. And that probably explains why you have these early 14,250 year old dates in Idaho, or actually they're pretty close to 15,000 BP. Now in Utah, in the Bonneville Basin of western Utah, human remains have found in Danger Cave that date to 11,000 BP. In Wyoming, all at the eastern entrance to Yellowstone National Park, at Mummy Cave, human occupation is proven to have occurred by 9,280 BP, and of special interest to me at least is the first occurrence this far south of what appears to be Nanamt, that is N-A-M-T, Northeast Asian, Northwest American microblade tradition, microblades, that we have recorded for the Tahltan-Stikine River drainage in northern British Columbia. At any rate, a Marxist perspective requires the motor of change to be internal to any given phenomenon. In this case, the mode of production is the internal motor of change in sociocultural evolution. Humans are first and foremost collective tool makers and users, so the part of the mode of production we must examine first is that part which is the very subject matter of much of North American archaeology, that is, stone tools. Now, the presence of grinding stones was important because it demonstrated the acquisition of the knowledge of making flour from wild seeds. Such knowledge prepared the people of the Great Basin to withstand the vagaries of climate change and the migration of large herd animals to terrains more to their liking. It was also important because it demonstrated the human sociocultural ability
to accept the Mesoamerican domesticated corn, or maize, when it arrived. Along with the arrival of this critical protein-supplying grass seed domesticate came the Mesoamerican squash and beans. Now, in other words, to accept something external, the recipients had to have technological preparation, and the Protoarchaic Fort Rock Cave levels did prove to have that preparation in the form of grinding stone technology. In the advent of the New World stage of agriculture that archaeologists call the formative, the preceding sociocultural evolutionary stage had to have preparation. And that will be the subject of our next lecture, the agricultural revolution in North America. But at any rate, to continue with this, primitive communism in Nevada, let's begin with Tule Springs. The site of Tule Springs is located 13 miles north of Las Vegas. In 1933, an obsidian flake was found in association with the remains of an extinct Pleistocene animal with a radiocarbon date of 28,000 years BP that was later derived, that is in 1955. A large-scale excavation took place over a 4-month period in late 1962, and more than 2 miles of trenches, up to 10 meters deep and 4 meters wide, were dug. Bulldozers were used to remove 180,000 tons of overburden. Now, large numbers of Pleistocene animal remains were found, including mammoths, camel, and horse bones, in association with 3 bone tools, a stone scraper, and 5 stone flakes. These are the stone tools of humans and the Pleistocene animals they followed. Now, in Sunshine, Nevada, it's in the north-central Great Basin of the Long Valley in Nevada, thousands of artifacts, primarily stone tools and waste flakes, were produced during the manufacture and repair of these stone tools. Late Pleistocene surface scatters spread over 2 miles and exhibit scrapers, burins, bifaces, and projectile points. A projectile point along with scraper and a biface was found in direct association with several bones of yesterday's camel, that is Camelops heserumus, dating 11,330 BP. Now, primitive communism in the Mojave Desert, Malcolm Rogers and George Carter. Malcolm Jennings Rogers, who lived from 1890 to 1960, was a pioneering archaeologist in Southern California, Baja California, and Arizona. His fieldwork included extensive survey and excavation work in the coastal zone of San Diego County and northwestern Baja California. Rogers explored which is of course in Mexico. Rogers explored the deserts to the east through western Arizona, and he identified and named the San Dieguito, La Jolla, Amargosa, and Yuman archaeological complexes. His formulations are the starting point for research in the region. Now, among Rogers' students was another person destined to become an expert on this region named George Carter, who lived from 1912 to 2004. Now, while Rogers was curator at the San Diego Museum of Man, he took Carter under his tutelage. And in the summer of 1930, Carter accompanied Rogers on a 5-week expedition to San Nicolas Island, where they excavated numerous sites. After college, Carter was hired by the San Diego Museum of Man and began working with his old mentor, Malcolm Jennings Rogers. The two conducted field work on the coast of Southern California and in the Mojave Desert. While surveying in 1937-38 near Silver Lake on the Mojave, Carter found the first Folsom fluted point, projectile point, in California. Now, in 1966, Rogers published his magnum opus, Ancient Hunters of the Far West. Carter and Rogers were eventually in dramatic disagreement over the age of human occupation of the Silver Lake area. Rogers thought it dated back to only 4,000 years ago. Carter said the geology proved 40,000 years to be the date. You want to keep in mind that this was a time at which North American archaeologists had the mistaken idea that people not entered the New World until after the end of the last ice age, and Carter never accepted that. Well, Rogers did. Now, Carter's got his PhD at Berkeley in 1941. During World War II, Carter was an analyst for the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the first U.S. Intelligence Service. In 1943, he left the OSS to teach geography at Johns Hopkins University, and in the summer, Carter would return to San Diego to conduct archaeological excavations seeking to prove that man had inhabited the Americas at an early date. In 1957, his findings were published in his book, Pleistocene Man at San Diego. For our purposes, the most important assertion made by Carter in that book is the date of early Wisconsin for human occupation of Southern California and the Mojave Desert. In 1967, Carter left Johns Hopkins University for Texas A&M University, and there he was a distinguished professor of geography until 1978. In 1977, I met him while conducting archaeological excavations along the La Jolla coast and into San Diego's Mission Valley. He was kind enough to invite me to his home, where he had a vast collection of artifacts from over the years he had collected from the Mojave Desert. And there's no doubt in my mind that these were left behind by prehistoric people. It was clear to me that these people were probably descendants of that first wave of Northeast Asian immigrants we had found at the Taltan River ancient site. In 1980, Carter published Earlier Than You Think, A Personal View of Man in America. The book describes Carter's evidence for humans arriving in North America approximately 100,000 years ago, which I now think is absolutely correct. Now, Mannix Basin. In the Great Basin, late Pleistocene and Holocene alluviation has buried and sealed earlier Pleistocene sediments. In the Mannix Basin of the lower Mojave Valley of San Bernardino County, California, ancient environments featured lakes, alluviation, and erosion, faulting and folding. Erosion of ancient lacustrine, that is lake, sediments has yielded a series of deposits that represent more than 350,000 years of Quaternary history. So we've got plenty of time depth there. The Mannix Basin, a structural basin in the central Mojave Desert, is the third and lowest major valley of the Mojave River. That river is now an exotic stream with episodic flow, which has its source in the San Bernardino Mountains, 120 miles to the southeast. And by episodic, I think what we mean here is flash floods. So, at any rate, a freshwater lake developed in the basin 500,000 years ago near the Calico Archaeological Site, which is not too far from Barstow, California. It was present until 18,000 BP. The last high stand of Lake Mannix was 1,781 feet and had a surface area of 91 square miles. The sediments of the Pleistocene Mannix Formation contain a prolifera of Racholabraean animals ranging in age from 350,000 to 20,000 BP. Fossils recovered include camel, horse, mammoth, saber-toothed cats, the dire wolf, short-faced bear, coyotes, flamingos, pelicans, eagles, swan, geese, the mallard duck, the ruddy duck, the canvasback duck, and the double-crested cormorant, the grebe, the crane, and the seagull, and stork. Now, for calico. In 1959, Louis Leakey, while at the British Museum of Natural History in London, received a visit from Ruth DeEtte Simpson, an archaeologist from California. Simpson had acquired ancient scrapers from a site in the Calico Hills to show to Leakey. Now, Leakey viewed it as important to study the Calico Hill site, as he was convinced that the number and distribution of native languages in the Americas required more time than 12,000 years to evolve, which was, as I say, the earliest acceptable date at that time among American archaeologists for the entry of humans into the New World. Now, in 1963, Leakey obtained funds from the National Geographic Society and commenced archaeological excavations with Simpson and Leakey and Simpson conducted excavations in an area stratigraphically separate from a verified 10,000-year-old site. At any rate, at Calico, they believed that they had located stone artifacts that were dated 100,000 years or older. Now, in 1966, I had taken my first course in archaeology and watched the National Geographic film in that course on Leakey's work in Olduvai Gorge of Tanzania. A few weeks into that course, I decided to become an archaeologist. Rachel, my constant companion, and I went to see Leakey speak to his wealthy supporters when he visited Los Angeles the following year. Shortly thereafter, I met with Ruth Simpson, who lived from 1918 to the year 2000, who was head of the San Bernardino County Museum by that time, and co-investigator with Leakey at the Calico site. The archaeologist Jeffrey Goodman, who worked at the site with Leakey, had also claimed the stone artifacts to be human-made. Louis Leakey continued to visit the site several times a year and was connected with the project until his death in 1972. The site was taken over by California's Bureau of Land Management and was open to the public, and today is the Calico Early Man site near Barstow in San Bernardino County, the central Mojave Desert of Southern California. Now, this site is on and in late Middle Pleistocene, now cemented, alluvial debris flow deposit known as the Calico Hills, the Yermo Hills, or the Yermo Formation. It includes artifacts of the Lake Mannix Lithic industry, LMLI, found on and just below the surface at elevations greater than 1,781 feet, with a shoreline elevation of 91 square miles of freshwater Pleistocene lake, which erupted approximately 18,000 years ago, emptied about 18,000 years ago. Now, material recovered from nested Pleistocene alluvial deposits stratigraphically beneath the 100,000-year-old soil profile include a rock ring, not a fire hearth, dated to 135,000 years by thermoluminescence. Then, about 200,000 years, it was dated by uranium series. And another date by beryllium was done, it puts it around 197,000 plus or minus 20,000 years. So all these dates are in rough agreement. The rock wren biface, a large well-formed bifacial tool recovered from a younger nested inset alluvial deposit at Calico, has been dated by sediment thermoluminescence to 14,400, 2,200 BP. Now, the tools and flakes of LMLI, Lake Mannix Lithic industry, and those found in the nested inset known as rock wren locality, are stone tool industries that consist of preforms, stone cores, flakes, and lithic waste, mainly of chalcedony. These are found on and in the late Middle Pleistocene age alluvial fan conglomerates and younger inset alluvial terraces in the Calico Hills, east of the Calico Peaks and the Calico Mountains. The location is in the central portion of Southern California's Mojave Desert. Historically, this archaeological project has also been known as the Calico Mountains Archaeological Site and the Calico Hills Archaeological Site. Today it is called the Calico Early Man Site. I think the creators of these lithic stage horizons are the descendants of the Tahltan River ancient terrace occupants we discussed in the previous chapter and lecture. They are lithic stage broad-spectrum wild resource motive production users that evolved from this early settlement of Northwest America. Meadowcroft has animal remains of 149 species. That's in Pennsylvania, and we're going to come to that later in this lecture, proving people gathered small game animals as well as wild plant nuts and seeds. Now, next we're going to move to the Great Plains. By 11,500 years ago, the small hunting-gathering bands with excellent weaponry populated the Great Plains of North America. Their motive production was broad-spectrum, wild resource exploitation. Their band and seasonally tribal economy featured the collective hunting of mammoths, bison, and other large mammals. The northern plains of Canada, the USA, and especially the montane basins of the central and southern Rocky Mountains contain some of the best evidence of this mode of production after 11,200 years ago. By 11,000 years ago, a number of large mammal species, including the mammoth, mastodon, camel, and horse, were extinct or nearly so, and some subspecies of bison would soon follow. At any rate, the main large mammal prey became the surviving bison. By 8,000 years ago, rising temperatures of the altithermal favored an increase in reliance on the small animal and plant food percentage of their hunting and gathering, and as we have seen, for this shift they were well prepared. A now extinct subspecies of bison was discovered at the Folsom site in northern New Mexico, and a mammoth at the Dent site in Colorado, as well as the Blackwater Draw in eastern New Mexico. Now in the central and southern plains, band-sized people were small and highly mobile, but they left evidence of their presence in well-stratified geologic contexts in a few ideal situations. Sophisticated radiocarbon dating and multidisciplinary investigations have enhanced the Lithic Protoarchaic archaeological chronology. In short, our knowledge of the chronology of late Lithic and Protoarchaic hunting and gathering bands is based on stratigraphy, artifact typology, and radiocarbon dates. For our purposes, there are 4 stratified, multi-component sites upon which to focus. These are Blackwater Draw in eastern New Mexico, Hell Gap in southeast Wyoming, Agate Basin in east central Wyoming, and Carter Kerr McGee in central Wyoming. However, there are numerous other sites with radiocarbon dated components that fit into this period as well. Now 7 cultural complexes, Clovis, Goshen, Folsom, Agate Basin, Hell Gap, Alberta, and Cody, are known from 11,200 years ago to 9,000 years BP. Clovis is the only one presently known to have confirmed association with mammoth remains and is recognized by the distinctive fluted projectile point. That Clovis point, or that fluted point, was the third autochthonous projectile point tradition arising from the first wave of immigrants to the New World. These first Americans had migrated through South America by 70,000 years ago. As they specialized, they developed 3 traceable and diagnostic projectile point types: the fish-tailed points of South America's Pacific coast, the Lerma points of Venezuela, and the fluted points of North America. My map showing this development is on the cover of Peopling of the Americas book, edited by John Erickson. Now, horses were extinct in North America, so the next arrival of horses had to await those escaping from the Spanish Ronin conquest of Mexico. Those escaping horses made their way into the southern plains. The pedestrian hunting-gathering peoples of this region soon captured some horses. The capture of these modern horses brought about a revolution in the social organization, as well as the technological strategy of subsistence on the Great Plains. As you can imagine, going from hunting and gathering on foot to riding horses brought about a radical change. A distinctive projectile point type is the diagnostic of Goshen. It was first recognized at the Hell Gap site in southeast Wyoming, and better defined at the Mill Iron site in southeast Montana. It was contemporaneous with late Clovis and early Folsom. Folsom is best known from the Lindemeyer site in Colorado, added distinctive flutes to their weaponry, which may have had both functional and ritual purposes. Overlapping with Folsom is the Agate Basin complex as defined by the Bison Kill site of this name in east central Wyoming. A projectile point very different but every bit as lethal as the preceding ones identifies it. The Hell Gap complex was recognized at the site with the same name in southeast Wyoming and appears to have developed directly from the immediately preceding Agate Basin. Several bison kills confirm the expertise of Hell Gap hunters and the efficiency of their weaponry. The Alberta complex introduced different but equally efficient weaponry in the form of a stemmed and shouldered projectile point. First recognized in southern Alberta, its age and chronological position were confirmed at the Hell Gap site, as were several other lithic stage complexes. A large Alberta bison kill is located in western Nebraska. Now, the Cody complex, named from the Horner site in northeast Wyoming, evolved directly from Alberta. The weaponry is more varied, and one part is the Eden projectile point, named after a bison kill site in western Wyoming. Another is recognized by the Scotts Bluff projectile point, named after a bison kill in western Nebraska. A diagnostic of the Cody complex is the tool known as the Cody knife type. After Cody, the archaeological picture on the northern plains and Rocky Mountains is unclear and is represented by a number of geographically isolated groups identified by a bewildering array of projectile points, mostly lanceolate in outline form, but some with stems and lateral restrictions, and nearly all with parallel diagonal pressure flaking patterns. One small bison kill in the Laramie Basin in southern Wyoming contains this type of projectile point and is radiocarbon dated at 8,000 years BP. Most of the evidence between 9 and 8,000 BP indicates a diminishing dependence on bison. After this date, and until 5,000 BP, bison become noticeably rare in northern plains archaeological sites. Bison in lithic stage times were larger and had different skull characteristics than the modern subspecies. These changes in northern plains bison are seen from the Arroyo Kill, radiocarbon dated at 6,500 years in the northeast Wyoming Black Hills. These animals are intermediate in size between modern bison and those of the late Pleistocene and early Holocene. The Black Hills of South Dakota and Wyoming during the 8,000 to 5,000 BP was a refugium for bison, while their numbers on the plains declined. The Goshen projectile points are technologically and morphologically identical to the Plainview complex, named after a bison kill on the southern plains. Thus, the Goshen complex developed in the northern plains, and its carriers migrated to the southern plains. Additionally, there are assemblages regarded as transitional between these complexes. One is the 10,000-year-old bison bone bed at the Horner site, in which the diagnostics demonstrate technological attributes of both Alberta and Cody. From 9,000 to 8,000 BP, human subsistence strategies demonstrate a lessening dependence on bison and more on plant and other animal resources, which is what you would expect as the climate changed and temperatures increased. The northern plains hunting-gathering bands had highly efficient weaponry systems. Clovis is the only lithic stage tool complex unequivocally associated with mammoth. This tool complex exhibits a projectile point that withstood the shock of penetrating thick mammoth hide and produced a lethal wound. Bands other than Clovis carriers perfected equally effective stone projectile points with sharp points and blade edges sufficient to open a large enough hole in the hide to allow the point and foreshaft to enter and produce a lethal wound. With the exception of the mammoth, most species hunted on the northern plains and Rocky Mountains in prehistoric times are present today. In the case of the bison and the mountain sheep, there was a gradual decrease in body size from the late Pleistocene until 5,000 BP, and then the present-day forms appear. Preserved mammoths and mammoth parts are increasingly recovered from frozen deposits thanks to climate change and provide good evidence of their physiology. Whether or not the matriarchal structure of mammoth and mastodon families was the same or even similar to that of African elephants is not yet known. This is an important issue in attempts to reconstruct Clovis hunting strategies because the matriarch elephant provides strong family protection. Any threat to a member of her family brings an immediate challenge. And although replicas of Clovis weaponry have proven lethal against African elephants, their skull structure prevents a Clovis projectile point using either thrusting spear or atlatl darts from being delivered with sufficient force to penetrate the brain cavity and produce instant death, thereby effectively excluding that hunting strategy. Elephants have relatively poor eyesight and acute sense of smell. Provided mammoths were similarly endowed, a more likely hunting strategy would have been for Clovis hunters to monitor a herd closely and carefully, and quietly spear an animal far enough away from the matriarch to avoid alerting her. It is critical to be properly positioned to obtain a lethal wound. The ideal location of penetration using Clovis weaponry is the rib cage forward of the diaphragm and high enough to penetrate the lungs. The heart is a bad choice because the ribs that widen and flatten distally protect it. The experienced hunter tries to avoid flesh and or stomach wounds, which clearly always result in time and effort wasted in trailing wounded animals. Now there are 3,300 to 4,400 pounds of meat on a juvenile mammoth. A strategy of stalking a single animal would have served the purpose in terms of meat products. The analysis of the Colby mammoth kill site in Wyoming suggests an accumulation of individuals killed over a period of time rather than a large group, that is 7 animals, killed at one time. The Lang-Ferguson sites in South Dakota involved 2 animals, one mature and the other a juvenile. After the Clovis and mammoth hunters extinct subspecies of bison, Bison antiquus and Bison occidentalis, were the main target of the Ankle Express hunters on the plains of North America. To date, the most visible bone bed suggests a large communal kill, but there were also single-person and small band hunting going on at the same time. So many natural and artificial features characterize lithic bison hunting. These include arroyos, parabolic sand dunes, and stampeding animals into narrow, deep, steep-sided cliffs. One component at the Horner site is a bison bone bed with remains of 70 animals. They were killed as a group in late fall or early winter in a shallow, low-gradient drainage channel, half a meter in depth. There are complete bison skeletons remaining after removal of unarticulated bones. A wooden corral to contain the animals exists at the Jones-Miller site in eastern Colorado. Hell Gap bison hunters at the central Wyoming Casper site utilized a long, narrow, steep-sided parabolic sand dune to trap nearly 100 animals in the late fall or early winter. The dune field nearby contains several features that would have served as operationally similar bison traps. And from these corralled animals, one could pick 1 or 2 bison at a time. Bison hunters at the Agate Basin site used a head cut in an arroyo to impede the animals. Analogs of these head cut features are in the surrounding area and in other areas with similar landforms. Pronghorn antelopes, Antilocrapra americana, camel, camelop species, and horse, Equus species, bones are found in lithic stage sites. The camel was extinct by 10,500 BP. Elk cervus, the scientific name is Cervus canadensis, skeletal remains are rare, but their antlers were used for tool, weaponry, and decorative items. More rare yet is evidence of mountain sheep, the Ovis canadensis, and the mule deer, the Odocolis hemionus in Plains lithic stage sites. Now, temporary storage of surplus meat by freezing was part of lithic stage subsistence strategy on the northern plains. A mammoth bone pile at the Colby site contains an articulated front quarter of an adult mammoth covered with long bones of other mammoths and topped with the skull of a young male. There was such a temporary cold weather. It was one of these temporary cold weather meat caches. Bison at the Agate Basin site were killed during the winter, and the animals were then cut into large units and frozen. Hunters then camped at the site and ate most of the meat before spring. Drying meat was common in historic times and was a common practice in Lithic stage times. Caches of tools and weaponry in different stages of manufacture and use comprise Clovis finds. Exceptionally high-quality stone tools, carved mammoth bone, and ivory are present in some of these caches. Evidence of shamanism in the form ethnographically recorded miniature projectile points and bone whistles, along with a large post hole, was found in a Hell Gap Age bison kill in eastern Colorado. Such a large post was used ethnographically by a shaman who stationed himself on top of the post with special paraphernalia to call the bison. The Cooper site, a large Folsom Age bison kill in northwest Oklahoma, contained a large male skull placed on top of the bone bed. These zigzag pattern of red ochre on the frontal part of that skull indicates ritual activity. And additionally, in this and in each of the some other bison kill sites, single unbroken and unused projectile points of unusually fine workmanship was recovered. Its morphology tends to refute its use as a lethal weapon, and it was probably part of a ritual. Large mammoth hunting characterizes northern plains lithic stage hunters who lived in small groups and were highly mobile. Raw materials for tool and weaponry manufacture were moved long distance by trade, across cultural boundaries, or by actually visiting these sources. Now, Lithic and Protoarchaic peoples adapted to a harsh environment with advanced tools and weaponry and were affluent in their own terms. Bison were hunted heavily, as were pronghorn antelope, and both species survived. The evidence for use of small mammals and plant food resources abounds in the archaeological record. All areas of the Rocky Mountains adjacent to the Great Plains were occupied and featured animal hunting. Now we move to the east. Primitive communism in Pennsylvania. Reliable radiocarbon dates of 19,000 BP date the bottom of the Meadowcroft rock shelter site in southeast Pennsylvania, some 27 miles from Pittsburgh. This is the earliest well-dated lithic stage archaeological site in North America. The Meadowcroft site has several occupation layers containing over 2,000 stone flakes and tools, 150 fire pits, and 1 million animal remains. A heavily cut and burnt deer antler base dated to 16,175 plus or minus 975 years BP was the oldest bone found at the site. Artifacts from the lowest cultural layers include bifaces, unifacial knives, projectile points, and small prismatic blades. Diagnostic is the 1 Miller lanceolate point dated roughly 12,000 BP. This is a medium to large lanceolate with an elliptical cross-section. The blade is excavate with the tip curving in, becoming widest at the top, third to 1/2, and curving back in toward the base. The blade may become parallel towards the base, forming a waist. The base is straight with square to basal corridors. This point has collateral to horizontal flaking and exhibits basal and hafting region grinding. The principal investigator, Professor Adovasio, says that the Meadowcroft point is a heavily reworked and shortened version of what a Miller point diagnostic would normally look like. And then at the Topper site, which is located on a terrace beside the Savannah River, 82 miles southwest of Columbia, South Carolina. Chert artifacts and burins have been retrieved and dated by thermoluminescence at earlier than 13,000, slightly earlier anyway, than 13,000 BP. Primitive communism in Virginia at Cactus Hill. Cactus Hill site is located 40 miles south of Richmond, Virginia, in a sand dune. It exhibits stratified series of cultural layers. The lowest level exhibits blades, projectile points, made of quartzite dated 16,670 pp, almost 17,000 years ago. Above that cultural layer at Cactus Hill in Virginia are basally fluted projectile points that date about 10,900 years pp. These early radiocarbon dates have been confirmed by optically simulated thermoluminescence. And that brings us to a conclusion of this lecture on the Protoarchaic lithic stage, Protoarchaic stage in North America. And next we're going to move, and that is prior to white contact, and next we're going to move to the agricultural revolution in North America in what archaeologists call the archaic and formative stages. And when I get done writing that, we'll have another lecture.